lighthouse stood at the edge of the world. At least, that's how it felt to Daniel the first night he arrived. It rose from the rocky coast of Nova Scotia, tall and white against the endless Atlantic. Waves moved steadily below, not violent, just constant. Kind of rhythm that never stopped, even when no one was watching. Daniel had never lived anywhere this quiet. Here, there was only the ocean, and the wind, and the slow revolving beam of the lighthouse. He had signed up for the winter caretaker position almost on impulse. Remote location, minimal contact, basic maintenance, and weekly supply runs. Good place to clear your head, the coordinator had told him. He hadn't realized how much clearing his head actually needed. First evening, he climbed the narrow spiral staircase inside the lighthouse. The metal steps echoed softly under his boots. The air smelled faintly of salt and old paint. At the top, the lantern room surrounded him in glass. Ocean in every direction, gray sky blending into gray water. The light rotated slowly, steady and patient. He stood there for a long time, listening. The waves below moved in a rhythm that felt older than everything else in his life. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. The ocean did not hurry. The keeper's cottage beside the lighthouse was small but warm. A wood stove in the corner, a thick wool blanket folded over a worn sofa, a kitchen window that looked out toward the cliffs. That first night, Daniel made simple soup and sat at the wooden table watching darkness settle over the water. When the sun disappeared, the lighthouse beam became brighter, more noticeable, like a slow heartbeat. He didn't turn on music. He didn't turn on the small radio sitting on the counter. He let the silence stay. It felt uncomfortable at first. Then it felt honest. By the third morning, his breathing had changed. He noticed it while standing outside with a mug of coffee. Back home, his breaths were shallow. Here, they were deeper, slower. The wind carried the scent of salt and cold stone. Gulls circled overhead, their calls distant and unhurried. He began developing small routines. Morning walk along the cliff path. Check the generator. Polish the lens glass inside the lantern room. Journal at the kitchen table while the light faded outside. The days were simple, but something inside him began to soften. One afternoon, while inspecting the lower rocks at low tide, he noticed someone sitting near the edge of the shore. A woman wrapped in a thick navy coat. She wasn't fishing, wasn't taking photos, just sitting, watching the water. Daniel hesitated before approaching. This stretch of coastline was mostly empty during winter. Visitors were rare. As he got closer, she turned her head slightly. "You're the new keeper," she said calmly. Her voice carried easily over the sound of the waves. "Yeah," he answered. "Daniel, Mev." She gave a small nod, then returned her gaze to the horizon. He stood there awkwardly for a moment. "You come here often?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Since I was a kid." The wind brushed between them, tugging lightly at their coats. "My father worked this lighthouse years ago," she added. Daniel looked back toward the tall white tower behind him. He must have liked the quiet. Mev's smile deepened slightly. He said the ocean doesn't ask questions. It just listens. They sat in silence after that. The waves moved steadily in and out. No rush, no urgency, just rhythm. Mev began appearing every few days, sometimes in the morning, sometimes near sunset. She never stayed long, just enough for a quiet conversation. She told him she lived in a small house a mile inland, worked remotely as a marine researcher tracking coastal patterns. "Winter is my favorite," she said once, watching foam gather at the rocks. "The tourists disappear. The ocean feels more like itself." Daniel understood that. He hadn't realized how much noise he'd been carrying until he came here. Noise from emails, deadlines, expectations, even conversations that felt rushed. Here, words didn't need to fill space. Sometimes they just sat together, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across dark water. Slow, reliable, steady. One evening, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Not violent, but strong enough to shake the cottage windows. Rain struck the glass in steady sheets. Wind howled gently around the tower. Daniel checked the generator twice. Everything secure. Inside, he lit extra candles, more for comfort than necessity. The ocean grew louder during storms. Not angry, just powerful, like a deep breath becoming stronger. There was a knock at the door, firm but calm. Daniel opened it to find Mev standing there, rain dripping from her hood. "Roads flooding near the lower path," she said. Thought I'd wait it out here. He stepped aside. Cottage felt warmer with someone else inside. She removed her coat and sat near the stove, holding her hands toward the heat. The storm continued outside, but inside there was only the crackle of firewood and the steady hum of wind around the lighthouse. You ever feel like the ocean carries things away? Daniel asked quietly. Maeve looked at him carefully. Sometimes, she said, but mostly, I think it reminds us how small our worries are. He nodded slowly. They listened as the lighthouse beam continued its rotation. Even during the storm, it never faltered. Steady light cutting through rain and darkness. A quiet promise. The storm lasted through the night. Maeve fell asleep briefly on the sofa, wrapped in the wool blanket. Daniel stayed awake longer than he meant to, sitting by the window. He realized something as he watched the waves. The ocean wasn't chaotic. It just moved, constantly, without asking permission. Maybe peace wasn't about stopping movement. Maybe it was about finding rhythm inside it. In the weeks that followed, winter deepened. The cliffs gathered frost in the mornings. The sky turned soft lavender at dusk. Daniel's thoughts slowed. Not empty, just less crowded. He stopped checking his phone every hour, stopped replaying old conversations in his head. Instead, he noticed small things. The way light reflected differently depending on cloud cover. The sound of waves against different parts of the shore. The faint creak of the lighthouse staircase at night. Maeve continued visiting, sometimes bringing fresh bread, sometimes bringing nothing but quiet company. One evening, they climbed the lighthouse together. At the top, wind pressed gently against the glass. The ocean stretched endlessly around them. Maeve stood near the lantern, watching the beam sweep outward. My father used to say, she began softly, this light doesn't control the ocean. It just guides what passes through. Daniel looked at her. That's enough, she added. They stood there for a long time, watching the beam rotate, watching the water breathe. As February turned toward March, Daniel knew his 3 months would end soon. He expected to feel restless. Instead, he felt steady, like the lighthouse itself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maeve sat beside him on the cliff. Are you going back? She asked gently. Eventually, he said. But he took a slow breath. But I don't think I'll carry the same noise with me, she smiled. That's the point. The sky darkened gradually. The first stars appeared. Behind them, the lighthouse turned on, its beam cutting calmly through the night. Steady, reliable, soft but strong. The ocean continued its rhythm below. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, listening, feeling, breathing. For the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel overwhelming. It felt vast, but peaceful. And somewhere between the ocean and the light, between the wind and the quiet, something inside him had finally settled. The lighthouse didn't calm the ocean. It never tried to. It simply stayed steady, and sometimes that was enough. Now, the train station in Maple Ridge was small enough that most people drove past it without noticing. It sat at the edge of town, surrounded by tall birch trees in a wide open field that turned golden in late summer. The building itself was brick, slightly faded, with a wooden bench beneath an old iron clock that ticked louder than necessary. Most trains stopped running there years ago, except one, the 6:40 p.m., the USK line. It didn't appear on most travel websites. You couldn't book it through the usual apps. Locals simply knew it existed. And every evening, just as the sky began turning soft shades of lavender and peach, the distant hum of its engine could be heard. Clara had never taken it. She lived in Maple Ridge her entire life, worked at the local post office, but she had always wondered where the dust train went. It never seemed crowded. Only a handful of passengers boarded each night. People who looked thoughtful, not rushed, not distracted, just quiet. One October evening, after a particularly long week, Clara closed the post office door and stood still on the sidewalk. The air smelled like fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. She felt restless, not unhappy, just stuck. The routine of her days had begun to blur together. Same streets, same greetings, same walk home beneath the same maple trees. When she heard the faint whistle of the 6:40 train in the distance, something inside her shifted. Without fully deciding, she turned her steps toward the station. Platform was nearly empty. An older man sat reading a newspaper. A young woman with headphones stood staring at the horizon. Middle-aged couple spoke quietly near the edge. The sky was deepening into evening colors, soft pink fading into blue. Clara sat on the wooden bench beneath the iron clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock-tick. At exactly 6:40, the train appeared around the curve of the tracks. It moved slower than modern trains, not old but unhurried. Its windows glowed warmly from inside, golden light spilling softly onto the platform. The doors opened with a gentle hiss. For a moment, Clara hesitated. Then she stepped forward. Inside, the train felt different from what she expected. There were no bright overhead lights. Instead, small lamps rested above each pair of seats. The seats were wide and upholstered in deep green fabric, soft, comfortable. It smelled faintly of coffee and old books. The conductor, a tall woman with silver hair pulled neatly back, nodded at her. First time, she asked kindly. Clara blinked. Is it obvious? The conductor smiled. We can always tell. She handed Clara a small paper ticket already stamped. No destination listed, Clara asked. The conductor's eyes softened. You'll see. The train began moving again, gliding smoothly along the tracks. No loud announcements, no rushing passengers, just a steady hum beneath her feet. As Maple Ridge disappeared behind them, Clara leaned her head lightly against the window. Outside, fields rolled past in muted autumn colors, orange, brown, fading gold. The sky grew darker by the minute. Inside, the train remained calm. A young boy across the aisle read a thick novel. An elderly woman whereupon slowly, her needles clicking in a quiet rhythm. One scrolled endlessly on their phones. No one seemed impatient. It felt like stepping into a slower version of time. After about 20 minutes, the train began to climb a gentle incline. Forests replaced fields. Tall pines stood like quiet guardians along the tracks. Clara noticed something unusual. The deeper into the woods they traveled, the lighter she felt. Not physically, but mentally. The thoughts that usually crowded her mind unfinished tasks, small worries. Tomorrow's schedule seemed to drift backward like the town shrinking behind them. The conductor passed by again. Comfortable, she asked softly. Clara nodded. Where does this train go? She finally asked. The conductor paused. It goes where people need a little space. That answer should have confused her. Instead, it made sense. The train eventually slowed near a small clearing surrounded by forest. There was no large station, just a simple wooden platform lit by hanging lanterns. The sign read Hollow Creek. Clara had never heard of it. A few passengers stood to leave. Without fully thinking, Clara followed. The air at Hollow Creek felt cooler, cleaner. The platform led to a short path lined with lanterns that guided toward a small lakeside village. It wasn't busy. A handful of cottages sat near the water. Warm light glowed from inside their windows. A cafe stood near the shore. Clara stepped inside. The cafe was quiet, filled with soft music playing from an old radio behind the counter. Bristol with kind eyes smiled at her. Evening, Clara ordered tea. She took her cup outside and sat by the lake. The water reflected the last shades of sunset. Gentle ripples moved across its surface. No loud boats, no traffic, just the occasional sound of wind brushing through trees. Other train passengers sat scattered along the shore. Some journaled, some simply watched the sky darken. No one seemed in a hurry to leave. Clara didn't check the time. For once, she didn't feel like she needed to. She let her shoulders drop. Let her breath slow. The lake mirrored the sky as stars began appearing, soft, patient. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang gently. The conductor's voice carried lightly along the path. Return train departing in 15 minutes. Clara stood slowly. Part of her didn't want to leave, but another part understood something important. That this train wasn't about escape. It was about pause. The return ride felt even quieter. Passengers leaned back comfortably in their seats. A few smiled faintly as if they'd set something down by the lake. Clara rested her head against the window again. When Maple Ridge came back into view, the town lights looked different, softer, less confining. The train eased into the station at exactly 9 p.m. The conductor handed Clara her stamped ticket as she stepped off. Same time tomorrow, she said gently. Clara looked at the small paper in her hand. It now had one word printed beneath the stamp: breathe. In the days that followed, Clara returned to her routine. But something had shifted. She didn't feel stuck anymore. because she knew the dust train existed, not as an escape route, but as a reminder that she could step away when she needed to, that quiet places still existed, that the world didn't always have to move fast. She didn't take the train every evening, only when her thoughts began to feel crowded again. Each time Hollow Creek waited, the lake calm, the lanterns glowing, the cafe warm, and each time she returned home a little lighter. Winter eventually dusted Maple Ridge with snow. The 6:40 train continued running, steam rising softly from its engine against the cold air. Clara stood on the platform one evening watching it arrive again. She smiled, because now she understood. The train that only ran at dusk wasn't mysterious. It was patient. It moved between busy days and quiet nights, between noise and stillness, between holding on and letting go. As long as it kept running, there would always be somewhere to sit by the water, somewhere to breathe, somewhere to remember that life didn't have to be rushed. Sometimes it only needed to slow down long enough for the sky to change colors, and for the heart to catch up. It was one of those soft Canadian evenings when the world feels like it is holding its breath. The sky above Banff was pale gray, just dim enough to make the street lights glow gently against the snow. Emma pulled her wool scarf closer around her neck as she stepped out of the bookstore where she worked. The bell above the door made a quiet chime, and then the door shut behind her with a cushioned click. Snow was beginning to fall, not heavy snow, not the kind that demands attention. This was the whispering kind, tiny flakes drifting down slowly, landing on eyelashes, melting softly. Emma loved this kind of snow. She paused on the sidewalk for a moment and simply listened. Snow changes sound. It softens the world. Cars pass more quietly. Footsteps become muffled. Even voices seem smaller, like they don't want to disturb the calm. She took a slow breath in. The air smelled clean, crisp pine from the mountains and the faint warmth of wood smoke from chimneys. Her shift had been long but peaceful. Winter always brought fewer tourists, which meant more time for quiet, more time for reading between customers, more time for stillness, and stillness had become something she loved. Emma had moved to Banff 2 years ago from Vancouver. The city had been loud, busy, with constant notifications. She hadn't realized how tired she was until she arrived here and heard nothing. At first, it felt strange, but slowly it had begun to feel like home. She started walking toward her apartment, boots crunching gently. The streetlights cast warm golden circles onto the ground, each one glowing softly like a lantern. Halfway down Bear Street, she noticed something unusual. The snowfall was growing thicker in one spot. In the small park beside the river, snow seemed to be drifting down more densely, almost like a curtain. Over that small patch of ground near the old wooden bench, the snow fell in a slow, steady spiral. Emma stopped. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't frightening. It was curious. She adjusted her scarf and stepped off the sidewalk, moving carefully toward the park. The snow beneath her boots made soft, cushioned sounds. The river nearby flowed lazily. As she approached the bench, the snowfall seemed to grow quieter, thicker, softer, like it was waiting. She reached the wooden bench and brushed off a light layer of snow before sitting down. Above her, the snow drifted downward in slow, mesmerizing patterns. Emma tilted her head back and watched. Each flake looked different, some small and sharp, others large and delicate. They turned in the air, catching the light from the nearby street lamp, tiny sparks of silver against the darkening sky. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she simply listened. The river, the distant hum of a car, the faint rustle of wind through pine trees, and the soft, endless descent of snow. Her breathing slowed. Hadn't meant to sit long. At groceries at home, a kettle waiting to be filled, a book halfway finished on her nightstand. But something about this snowfall felt personal, intentional, as if the night itself had paused just for her. Emma opened her eyes again and noticed something resting on the bench beside her. A small envelope dot white, slightly damp from snow, but not soaked. She frowned gently. She was certain it hadn't been there before. Park was nearly empty. She hadn't seen anyone leave. The bench had been bare when she brushed it off. Yet here it was. She picked it up carefully. There was no stamp, no address, just a single word written across the front. Stay. Emma's heart did not race, it simply softened. She turned the envelope over and opened it slowly. Inside was a small piece of folded paper. She unfolded it. The message inside was short, You don't have to rush. The quiet is not empty. It is holding you. Emma read it again and again. The snowfall continued. Her eyes moved across the park, searching gently for someone watching. Someone smiling from behind a tree, but the park remained still, peaceful, undisturbed. The river flowed. The snow fell. The bench creaked softly as she shifted. Tears didn't fall, but something inside her loosened. For months, she had carried a quiet pressure, the feeling that she should be doing more, achieving more, moving faster. Even here, part of her mind whispered that she was behind, that she needed to chase something, career, love, success, noise. But this note, simple and small, felt like permission. Permission to breathe, permission to stay. She looked up again at the sky. The snow seemed even, softer now. A warm light glowed from a nearby cabin across the river. Somewhere, a door closed gently. Somewhere else, laughter echoed faintly and then faded. Life was happening, but it wasn't rushing. Emma folded the note carefully and placed it back. She tucked it into her coat pocket, close to her chest. She stayed on the bench for a long time, long enough for the snowfall to lighten, long enough for the sky to darken completely, long enough for her breathing to match the rhythm of the river. Eventually, the flakes thinned. The thick curtain above her slowly dissolved, returning to the same soft drift that covered the town. As if the snowfall had completed its task, Emma stood slowly. The bench was dusted again with snow. The ground around her showed only her footprints leading in. No other prints nearby. She smiled softly. Okay, she whispered to the night. I'll stay. Not forever, not in one place, but in this moment, in this calm. She walked home more slowly than before. She noticed the way the snow sparkled under the street lights, the gentle rhythm of her steps, the warmth waiting in her small apartment. When she reached her door, she paused before going inside and looked back toward the park. It was quiet again, completely ordinary, and yet she felt different inside. She boiled water for tea. Pail began its familiar soft whistle. Steam curled upward. She wrapped both hands around the warm mug and stood by her window. Snow continued falling lightly. No dramatic music, no grand mystery solved. Just quiet, just peace, and in her coat pocket, a small envelope that reminded her that sometimes the world slows down, not because it is empty, but because it is making space for you to rest. That night, Emma slept deeply, outside. The snowfall continued for hours, covering the town, and somewhere in the quiet, the bench by the river waited patiently for the next person who needed to hear the same gentle message. Stay, breathe. You're not behind. You are exactly where you need to be. Now, on the far edge of Nova Scotia's coast, where the Atlantic stretches endlessly into gray-blue distance, there stands a small lighthouse that most maps barely notice. It isn't famous. It isn't tall. It doesn't appear in postcards very often. But if you ask the locals in a quiet fishing village near Lunenburg, they'll tell you something unusual about it. At midnight, when the tide is calm and the wind is gentle, the lighthouse hums. Not loudly, not eerily, just a low, steady vibration, like someone softly humming a lullaby into the ocean. No one knows why, and no one seems afraid of it. Daniel discovered it by accident. He had moved to the village the previous autumn after leaving Toronto. The city had been overwhelming, endless traffic glowing off its towers, constant deadlines that seemed to multiply overnight. His job in software design paid well, but it had slowly drained the color from his days. So he left. No big announcement, no dramatic goodbye. Just packed his suitcases, rented a small coastal cottage, and decided he needed air that smelled like salt instead of asphalt. The cottage was simple. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, windows that faced the sea. At night, he could hear waves brushing against rocks below the cliffs. It was quiet here, so quiet that sometimes his ears rang from the absence of noise. The first week felt strange. The second week felt slower. By the third week, he noticed he was sleeping through the night for the first time in years. One evening, unable to sleep, Daniel stepped outside just before midnight. The sky was cloudless. Stars stretched endlessly above him. The ocean shimmered faintly in moonlight. He pulled his sweater tighter and walked toward the narrow coastal path that led along the cliffs. That's when he heard it, a hum low, continuous, gentle. It wasn't mechanical, exactly. It didn't sound broken or metallic. It sounded human, like someone humming softly behind a closed door. He followed the sound carefully along the path until he reached a small lighthouse perched at the edge of the rocks. It stood only 3 stories tall, painted white with a faded red top. Its beam rotated slowly, sweeping light across the water, and beneath the rotation of light, the humming continued. Daniel stood there for a long moment listening. The sound vibrated faintly through the wooden railing near the lighthouse base. It wasn't loud enough to disturb the night. It blended into the rhythm of waves and wind. He placed his hand against the lighthouse wall. He could feel it, a soft tremor, as if the structure itself were breathing. He expected to feel unsettled, but instead he felt calm. The hum carried no urgency, no warning, no sorrow. It felt like reassurance. Daniel sat down on a flat rock near the base of the lighthouse and closed his eyes. The beam of light passed over him every few seconds, warm and brief, then gone again. The tide rolled in and out with quiet patience, and the humming continued steady, unhurried. He stayed until nearly 1 in the morning before returning to his cottage. The next day, he asked Mrs. McLeod, the elderly woman who owned the small grocery shop in town, about it. "Oh, the humming," she said with a gentle smile, as if he had asked about the weather. "Yes, dear. It's done that for as long as I can remember." "Is something wrong with it?" Daniel asked. She shook her head slowly. "No. The engineers checked years ago. Everything works fine. They say it's the wind moving through the structure in a particular way." She leaned closer, lowering her voice playfully. "But I think it just likes to sing." Daniel laughed softly. That night, he returned to the lighthouse again, and the night after that. Soon, it became a quiet ritual. 11:55 p.m., he would walk the path, hands in his coat pockets, breathing in the salt air. He would sit near the lighthouse and wait for midnight, and just as the clock in his cottage would have turned to 12, the humming would begin. Soft low endless. He began bringing a blanket and a thermos of tea. Sometimes he would simply sit and listen. Other times he would close his eyes and let the vibration settle into his chest. The hum seemed to match his breathing, slow in, slow out. The ocean moved with it. The stars shimmered above. One particularly calm night in late winter, the sea was almost perfectly still. The moon reflected across the surface like a silver road. Daniel sat as usual, waiting. Midnight came. The hum began. But tonight, something felt different, stronger. Not louder, but deeper. He placed his hand against the lighthouse again, and this time the vibration felt more pronounced. It moved through his palm, up his arm, settling gently behind his ribs. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt something release. All the tension he hadn't known he was holding, deadlines, expectations, unfinished projects, old regrets, seemed to loosen. The humming didn't erase his past. It didn't solve his future. It simply reminded him that life could move slowly and still move forward. He realized then that the hum wasn't for ships. It wasn't for tourists. It wasn't even for the village. It was for anyone who needed to sit still long enough to hear it. Tears slipped quietly down his cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. The wind brushed gently against his face. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation. The hum carried on. That night, Daniel stopped checking his phone before bed. He stopped measuring his worth by productivity. He started sketching again, something he had loved as a teenager but abandoned when real life took over. He filled pages with drawings of the lighthouse, the cliffs, the waves, the stars, and always at the edge of his sketches he would write one word: breathe. Spring eventually came to Nova Scotia. The snow melted. The cliffs grew greener. Fishing boats returned more frequently to the harbor. But the lighthouse continued humming at midnight, always steady, always calm. One evening, a tourist couple asked Daniel if the humming was true. He smiled softly. "Yes," he said, "but you have to listen carefully." That night, he saw them sitting near the base of the lighthouse, holding hands, waiting. At midnight, the hum began. The woman's eyes widened slightly. The man tilted his head closer, and then both of them relaxed. Daniel watched from a distance, feeling something warm settle in his chest. The lighthouse didn't belong to him. It belonged to the quiet, to the ocean, to the midnight hour. Months later, when Daniel finally decided to return to Toronto for a short visit, he felt different, lighter, stronger. Before leaving, he walked to the lighthouse one last time. He placed his hand against its cool white wall. Midnight came. The hum began. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The vibration answered in its own gentle way, steady, unwavering, constant, as he walked back toward his cottage under a sky full of stars.